The warm South Carolina sun beat down on the small kitchen, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of herbs, spices, and the promise of something far darker than anyone could imagine. At the center of it all stood Josiah, a cook whose talents were known across the land. But it wasn't just his skill with food that earned him respect. It was the deadly secret he carried with each dish he prepared. Welcome back to Grave of the Shadows, where we delve into the chilling, the mysterious, and the unspeakable. If you love stories that mix history with intrigue, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our tales from the shadows. Josiah had been quiet for years, blending in among the kitchen staff of the estate. His movements swift and measured. The noblemen and women who sat at his table never suspected that the delicate meals they consumed were laced with a slow poison. For Josiah, cooking wasn't just an art. It was his quiet form of revenge. Revenge for the brutal death of his father, whose hanging was still fresh in his mind. A man wrongfully accused, beaten, and left to rot. But now, every meal Josiah prepared was his chance to serve justice in a way that no one saw coming. Each dish was a carefully crafted weapon, a dose of death hidden in plain sight, served with a smile. The irony was that the same hands that fed them also held their fate in a pinch. Stay tuned as we unravel the story of a cook who served death in every dish, and discover just how deep Josiah's revenge ran. The estate was an imposing structure, a grand mansion surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and an immaculate garden, its beauty almost mocking the darker truths that lurked beneath. South Carolina in 1854 was a land marked by contradiction. An idyllic facade on the outside, yet plagued by the brutal realities of slavery, oppression, and injustice on the inside. The plantation where Josiah worked had long been the heart of this duality, its sprawling grounds and polished floors hiding the stories of exploitation and despair. Inside the mansion, the air was always thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, roasted meats, and the intoxicating spices that Josiah expertly blended in his cooking. But behind every dish lay a calculation. Every pinch of salt, every slice of meat, a reminder of the carefully crafted plan that Josiah had been silently executing. No one knew the dark secret he kept hidden behind his calm demeanor and gentle hands in the kitchen. They only knew him as a master cook, someone whose culinary talents were admired by the rich and powerful who dined at the long mahogany table every evening. Josiah's kitchen was his kingdom, a small, smoke-filled room in the back of the mansion, where the air was thick with the smells of simmering stews and roasted meats. The large iron stove crackled with life, its heat rising like a quiet, invisible force. The pots and pans clanged together in a rhythm known only to Josiah and his assistant, a young man named Thomas, who was eager but often too nervous to keep up with Josiah's fast pace. But Josiah wasn't focused on his assistant's mistakes. His eyes were always alert, calculating, watching the clock, observing every movement from the staff and the masters of the house. He noticed when the guests arrived, always on time, always with their fine clothes and airs of superiority. He noted the servants' fearful glances as they silently obeyed the orders of their masters, their faces betraying the exhaustion and hopelessness they felt. He knew the dynamics, the unspoken hierarchy that governed the estate, and he used it all to his advantage. Though Josiah's hands were steady, his mind was anything but. The trauma of losing his father had shaped him in ways no one could understand. His father had been a man of strength and dignity, a man who had fought for what he believed in, only to be betrayed and left to die in the harshest of ways. That moment, the moment Josiah had watched his father hang from a tree, helpless and broken, had set him on this path. And now, as the cook, he had the power to control the very lives of those who had wronged him, using his craft as a weapon. As Josiah stood by the stove, carefully stirring the bubbling pot of stew, his thoughts drifted back to the day of his father's death. The memory was a sharp, jagged edge, one that had never dulled with time. It was the memory that drove him, the fire that fueled every dish he created. It was the reason he worked in silence, never drawing attention to himself, always patient, always waiting. Josiah had always been a quiet man. Growing up, He was the type of child who preferred observing rather than participating, watching people, noticing the subtle movements of others, studying their reactions. It wasn't out of shyness, but out of necessity. He had learned early on that silence was a weapon in itself, a shield against the cruelty of the world around him. His father, a proud man of principle, had never taught him to be silent, but the boy's temperament had evolved in response to the violence and injustice that defined his life. He had been born on this very estate, the son of a strong and proud man, but one who had not survived the system that kept him enslaved. Josiah's memories of his father were hazy at first. He was only a boy, barely 6 when his father was torn from their home and forced into brutal labor. Josiah had watched his father work with a resilience that shone despite the hardships. His father never allowed the indignities of being enslaved to break his spirit. But it had all ended one fateful day when his father had dared to speak up. Josiah's father had demanded better treatment for the workers, a plea for basic human decency. But his words had been met with violence. That night, Josiah's world shattered as he watched his father's lifeless body hang from a tree outside the estate. The memory of that horrific image, the rope, the cold wind, the cruel faces of those responsible, had haunted him every day since. He had stood there, frozen, his young mind struggling to process the injustice, the pain, and the helplessness. After his father's death, Josiah became the man of the house. His mother, broken by grief, was unable to hold things together. The weight of loss became a constant shadow in their lives. The estate, once a symbol of power, was now a place of oppression, where Josiah had to fend for his own survival. Josiah, though young, became increasingly aware of the power that came with food. He had always been drawn to the kitchen, watching the cooks prepare meals with precision, their hands moving like artisans creating works of art. Cooking was something that didn't require the approval of others. It was a skill that could transcend the roles imposed on him by the world around him. It was a place where he could wield control, something he had lost when his father died. But Josiah wasn't interested in simply cooking. He had a plan. Every meal he prepared had a purpose, every dish a message. He had learned from watching others how to wield food as a tool of power, of revenge, of justice. It started with small acts, subtle infusions of bitterness into the dishes served to the masters of the estate. The seasoned spices and ingredients were not just for flavor. They were poison in disguise. A touch of nightshade here, a pinch of arsenic there, enough to make them sick, to make them weak, but never enough to kill. At least not yet. As Josiah honed his skills, he became a figure of quiet respect among the other servants. They didn't know the depths of his plans, but they trusted him. The meals he prepared were always impeccably done, rich, flavorful, and perfectly seasoned. He became known not just for his talent, but for his composure. His ability to stay calm in the face of the cruelty and hatred surrounding him was something others admired, though they didn't understand it. Josiah had learned to mask his feelings, to wear a mask of calm and control, even when his insides churned with rage. It wasn't just the kitchen where Josiah's talents lay. His eyes were always scanning, always alert, always taking in the details others missed. He knew when someone was being mistreated. He knew who to trust, who to avoid. Josiah had become an expert at reading people, their fears, their weaknesses, their desires. He had learned that silence was often the most powerful weapon one could wield, and he used it to his advantage. But beneath that calm, beneath the steady hand that stirred the pot, something darker was simmering. Josiah's transformation was nearly complete. His quest for justice had begun, and the first ingredient of his vengeance had already been mixed in. It had taken years for Josiah to plan this first act of revenge. Every movement in the kitchen, every glance from the masters, every word spoken by the overseers, all of it had been part of his careful calculation. He was no fool. Josiah knew better than anyone that his revenge had to be precise, methodical, and subtle. A single misstep could ruin everything. The target was chosen not by impulse, but because of his arrogance. Mr. Barrett, the estate's overseer, was a man who believed himself untouchable. He treated the slaves with cruelty, barking orders without a second thought, and taking pleasure in their suffering. His greed and his cruelty were well known, and Josiah had witnessed his numerous acts of violence, turning a blind eye whenever a mistake was made or a person crossed him. Josiah had always hated him, but hatred alone didn't motivate him. It was the power he wanted, the power to control, to make the abusers feel the helplessness they had imposed on others. The dinner for Mr. Barrett had been planned carefully. Josiah knew that Barrett would be the guest of honor at the upcoming estate banquet. It was the perfect opportunity, an evening where all the wealthy and influential figures would gather, drinking and feasting. The poison would be disguised in the most opulent dish. Josiah had chosen to prepare a rich venison stew, its robust flavors masking the subtle bitterness of the poison he'd perfected. It was a dish that would impress, one that would make Barrett the center of attention, his presence inescapable. He worked quickly in the kitchen, moving through the familiar motions. His hands were steady as he prepared the venison, his knife slicing through the tender meat with precision. The ingredients had been chosen for their richness, but hidden within the mixture were elements that only Josiah knew how to use. An herb to induce a slow, agonizing paralysis, and another ingredient to leave the body weak and helpless. The staff in the kitchen had no idea. They worked around Josiah, their chatter a soft hum in the background as they prepared other dishes. Josiah was silent, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. It was strange how much peace he found in this process. The cutting, the simmering, the blending of ingredients, it was all part of his art. Cooking was his expression, his control. With each ingredient he added, he thought of his father. He thought of that horrible day, the moment the rope had tightened around his father's neck. The unfairness, the helplessness, the burn of tears in his eyes, the rage that had surged inside him. It was that feeling he wanted to recreate in Barrett. The slow, suffocating feeling of losing control. When the stew was ready, Josiah carefully ladled it into a large serving dish. He took his time, placing the dish on the polished silver platter and covering it with a cloth. Everything had to be perfect. His heart pounded in his chest as he wiped his hands, ensuring that there were no traces left. The scent of the venison stew filled the kitchen, and for a moment, Josiah almost felt a pang of guilt. But then he reminded himself this was justice. This was for his father, for all those who had suffered under the cruelty of men like Barrett. As the platter was carried out to the dining room, Josiah stood silently in the kitchen, waiting. The staff had been busy preparing the rest of the meal, and the house was alive with the sound of clinking glasses and laughter. But none of that mattered. All Josiah cared about now was Barrett's fate. The guests were seated at the long, grand table, their faces lit by the soft glow of candlelight. Barrett, as expected, took his place at the head of the table, a smug smile on his face as he surveyed the crowd. He never noticed Josiah as he entered the dining room, but the cook didn't care. His focus was entirely on the dish. The stew was served, and Barrett took the first bite, savoring the rich flavors as he spoke to his guests. The conversation flowed, but Josiah could barely hear it over the pounding in his ears. He watched Barrett carefully, his eyes fixed on the man, waiting for the first signs of the poison to take effect. First, there was nothing. Barrett continued to eat, talking loudly, enjoying the attention. But slowly, Josiah saw his posture shift. His shoulders tensed. He paused, wiping his brow with a napkin. The smile on his face began to fade. Josiah's heart skipped a beat. The poison was working. Barrett's face began to pale, his words slurring as he tried to speak. He clutched his throat, gasping for air. The room grew quieter as people turned to look at him, confusion and alarm spreading across the table. Josiah's heart pounded in his chest, but he maintained his composure. His work was far from over. Barrett stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass of wine, but his legs wobbled beneath him. He collapsed back into his chair, struggling to breathe. A servant rushed to his side, but there was nothing anyone could do. Josiah watched as the life slowly drained from the man. It was as slow as it was agonizing, just as Josiah had planned. Finally, Barrett slumped forward, his body stiff with the effects of the poison. The guests screamed in panic, But Josiah remained calm, his expression unchanged. He had served his justice, and he had done so quietly, without ever raising his voice. The deed was done. The air in the dining room was thick with confusion and panic. Guests stumbled over their words, their faces twisted in disbelief as they tried to understand what had just happened. The servant who had rushed to Barrett's side looked helpless, his face ashen as he attempted to revive the unconscious man. Josiah, standing silently in the doorway of the kitchen, watched the chaos unfold. It was almost surreal watching the mighty overseer, the one who had wielded so much power over the estate, reduced to a trembling, powerless body. Barrett's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals. His fingers clutched the sides of the chair, knuckles white, as though the chair itself could somehow offer him stability. His face was pale, tinged with blue at the edges. His eyes were wide, darting around in panic, searching for someone to save him. But there was no one. No one could save him now. One of the guests, a woman with an air of dignity, gasped and clutched her pearls. "Someone do something," she cried. The panic in her voice echoed in the room, amplifying the fear that had already taken root. Another man, clearly the most level-headed of the group, rushed to Barrett, kneeling beside him. He checked the man's pulse, his face drawn tight with concern. "He's still alive," the man said, his voice strained. "But barely. What happened? What did he eat?" A murmur rippled through the room as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. The stew. It was the only thing they could all point to. The rich, savory dish that had been served with such pride was now the center of suspicion. Josiah's eyes never left Barrett. He stood at the threshold, blending into the shadows, his heart calm, his mind cold. He didn't need to do anything more. He had done his part, and now the poison was doing the rest. The slow, agonizing process of death was taking hold of Barrett, and Josiah felt an eerie satisfaction in the inevitability of it all. Barrett's body jerked once, violently, as his stomach contracted in agony. His hands were clutching at his throat, but there was no relief. The poison had taken hold, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The once powerful man who had tormented so many now lay helpless, a shadow of his former self. The guests stood frozen, their eyes locked on the scene before them. Some were still too shocked to move, while others began to back away, unwilling to get too close. But no one dared to leave. They were all trapped in the same room, waiting for the inevitable. The sounds of Barrett's suffering filled the space. Gasping breaths, muffled cries for help, and the occasional rattle that sounded too final to ignore. Josiah's gaze remained steady, but his mind was far from the chaos in the room. His thoughts returned to his father, the man who had been taken from him so brutally. His mind replayed the image of his father's lifeless body, strung up for all to see. He thought about the years of oppression, the years of servitude, the years of living under the thumb of men like Barrett. And now, in this moment, Josiah had the power to make them feel the same helplessness, the same fear that had consumed him as a child. Barrett's body went still for a moment. A brief, horrible silence followed, and for a split second, it seemed like the man might have finally given in. But then, as if on cue, his body heaved once more, a final desperate attempt to grasp for air, only to collapse into unconsciousness. The guests were no longer just observing, they were reacting. Some were sobbing, others were shouting for help, but Josiah remained unmoving. The silence that followed the chaos seemed almost more deafening than the noise that preceded it. The last breaths of the man who had made so many suffer were now just a memory, an unfortunate series of gasps that would soon fade into nothing. Josiah's eyes finally shifted away from Barrett's body as the servant tried to lift him, but it was too late. The poison had done its job, and Josiah had served the justice that had been denied for so long. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't require a single word, only the calm precision of a cook who knew exactly how to blend bitterness with flavor. As Barrett's body was finally removed from the dining hall, the remaining guests stood frozen in place, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The quiet hum of confusion gradually turned into panic. Conversations murmured in hushed tones, questions filling the air, but no answers were forthcoming. All eyes were on the staff now, especially the ones who had served the food. They could sense it, the suspicion. They could feel the weight of every gaze on them, but none of them spoke. The mansion felt colder now, the air thick with uncertainty and dread. Josiah knew the moment the first cry for help had gone up. It was only a matter of time before the investigation began. The slow, methodical response of the household staff was to remain silent and carry on with their tasks, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But Josiah knew that beneath that veneer of calm, the wheels were already turning. Questions would be asked. The truth would be sought. Lieutenant Hawkins, a young officer with a sharp eye and a growing reputation in the area, arrived with 2 of his men. He had been called to the estate immediately after the incident, though he could only guess what had happened. Barrett's sudden collapse had shocked everyone, and now the reality of a possible foul play hovered over the estate like a dark cloud. The lieutenant stepped into the dining hall, his boots clicking against the polished marble floors. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the stunned faces of the remaining guests, each one looking more frightened than the last. Hawkins was a man of few words, but he had a reputation for getting results, especially when it came to mysterious deaths like the one that had just occurred. He had seen enough in his years of service to know when something didn't add up. "Who served the meal?" Hawkins asked, his voice authoritative yet calm, cutting through the tension. Josiah didn't flinch. He stood behind the kitchen door, watching as Hawkins interrogated the staff. His heart beat steadily in his chest, his face an impassive mask. He knew his role. He had to remain calm, not let his composure slip. His only concern now was maintaining control. He had already executed the plan, and now he simply needed to remain out of sight until the investigation passed. The head butler, an elderly man with a shaky hand, spoke up. "The cook, sir. Josiah was the one who prepared the dinner. He's the one who brought out the venison stew." Hawkins turned his attention towards Josiah, whose eyes met the lieutenant's for just a fraction of a second before he turned away. The suspicion was clear. Hawkins didn't ask any more questions, but the silence spoke volumes. He knew the cook was the key to understanding what had happened. If this was murder, Josiah had likely played a part. He just needed proof. Hawkins gestured for one of his men to step forward. "Get the staff statements," he ordered. "I want every detail. Who saw what, who touched what, and who was near Mr. Barrett before his collapse. Leave nothing to chance." The staff members were questioned one by one, their nerves palpable as they spoke in shaky voices. Each one repeated the same story: how they had served the food, how they had watched Mr. Barrett eat with delight, completely unaware that he was slowly being poisoned. They all spoke the same, each detailing every movement, every glance, as if they were recounting a performance in front of an audience. But Hawkins wasn't satisfied. He'd seen too many cases where the obvious didn't always lead to the truth. His mind worked quickly, analyzing the details he was given. Something about the way the guests reacted, so quickly, so collectively, didn't sit right with him. There was a calmness to it that didn't match the chaos of a man suddenly dying at the table. Was it possible that the staff had known? Were they involved? Josiah's thoughts were interrupted as Hawkins walked slowly towards the kitchen. The lieutenant's sharp eyes lingered on the door, but Josiah stayed out of view. He felt the officer's gaze, but he didn't dare look back. Instead, he busied himself with the mundane tasks of cleaning the counters, making it look as though nothing had changed. But his mind was racing. Hawkins was getting closer. Soon he would be asking questions, and Josiah needed to be ready for that moment. When Hawkins finally entered the kitchen, he didn't speak immediately. He took his time looking at the pots, the stove, and the shelves. His gaze lingered on the herbs, the spices, the utensils. It was as though he was trying to find something, anything that could give him a clue as to what had gone wrong. Josiah didn't respond to the scrutiny. He continued working in silence, wiping the countertops with deliberate care. Every motion was calculated. Every step was part of the performance. "You're the cook here, right?" Hawkins finally asked, his voice low and steady. Josiah nodded without looking up. Yes, sir. I prepared the meal tonight. Hawkins' eyes narrowed slightly. He could sense the tension in the air, but there was something else there too. Something off, something too controlled. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew Josiah was hiding something. The question was, would Hawkins be able to uncover it before Josiah's next move? The days that followed were filled with a silence that felt both suffocating and soothing to Josiah. The investigation had progressed slowly, as it always did with matters like these. The local authorities were no closer to finding out who had poisoned Mr. Barrett, but the sense of unease hung heavily over the estate. The guests had gone home, their faces still pale with shock, but Josiah remained. He had done what he set out to do, yet the satisfaction he had expected to feel was absent. At night, when the kitchen grew quiet and the last of the staff retreated to their rooms, Josiah sat by the stove, staring into the flickering flames. His mind wandered back to the night of the banquet, to Barrett's final moments. He could still hear the desperate gasps for air, the helplessness in his victim's eyes. It wasn't the first death Josiah had caused. He had taken lives before in a different way for a different purpose. But this felt different. He had always been taught to never show emotion, to never let anyone see the weight of his actions. But now, as he sat in the darkness, he could feel the burden of what he had done pressing down on him. The image of his father's body, hanging from that tree, flashed in his mind again. The anger he had felt that day, the helplessness, had fueled him ever since. But was this vengeance truly justice? Or had he become the very thing he had once despised? Josiah's hands trembled as he wiped the counter, his thoughts consumed by the consequences of his actions. His mind replayed the moments leading up to Barrett's death. The precise measurements of poison, the deliberate way he had mixed the ingredients, the cold calculation behind every dish. He had worked for years, perfecting his craft, learning to wield food as a weapon. But now he was beginning to question whether it had all been worth it. Had it satisfied the need for revenge, or had it merely opened the door to a darker part of himself? The quiet of the kitchen became deafening as Josiah's doubts swirled in his mind. The faces of the other slaves, the servants who had watched him work without knowing his true intentions, came to him in fleeting images. He had done this for them too, hadn't he? For the ones who suffered under the same cruel hands, for the ones who had been oppressed for so long. But then again, who had he really done this for? Himself or the people he had once loved? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the kitchen door. Josiah's heart skipped a beat as he quickly straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. He opened the door slowly to find Thomas, the young assistant who had worked alongside him in the kitchen. "Josiah," Thomas said quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. I overheard something." Josiah raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for the young man to continue. "Some of the other staff, they're talking. They think it was you," Thomas whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "They think you poisoned Mr. Barrett." Josiah's heart clenched. He had expected suspicion to fall on him sooner or later, but hearing it from Thomas, hearing it out loud, made it feel real in a way that chilled him to the bone. "And what do you think, Thomas?" Josiah asked, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil he was feeling inside. Thomas shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder before answering. "I don't know, Josiah, but I saw the way you looked at him. I saw what you did." Josiah's jaw tightened. He didn't need to say anything else. Thomas wasn't wrong. The guilt that Josiah had been trying to suppress now threatened to overwhelm him. He had spent years hiding his true nature, but now it was as if everything was starting to unravel. "I didn't want to get involved in this," Thomas added quickly. "I just wanted to let you know. Be careful. People are watching." Josiah nodded slowly, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. But he also knew there was no turning back. Not now. He had made his choices, and now he would have to live with the consequences. As Thomas left, Josiah closed the door behind him, his thoughts spiraling. The quiet struggle within him raged on, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, he would continue his plan. He would carry on with his revenge, not just for his father, but for himself. For the man he had become. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Days had passed since Barrett's sudden collapse, but the atmosphere within the estate was far from normal. The once lively chatter of the servants was now replaced by hushed conversations, and the elegant halls that had hosted joyous gatherings now felt like a prison of uncertainty. Josiah had been on edge since that night, and the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Every time he entered a room, he could feel eyes on him, the weight of suspicion pressing down on his shoulders. The servants exchanged nervous glances whenever he passed by, their conversations halting abruptly, but no one dared approach him directly. It was as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake, for him to slip up. They were too afraid to confront him openly, but they were no longer as trusting as they once were. Josiah had spent years perfecting his role as the quiet cook, the unassuming servant who worked tirelessly in the background. His calm exterior had always been his shield, his weapon. But now that calm was cracking and he could feel it. It was as if the walls of the estate had ears, and they were closing in on him. Lieutenant Hawkins had returned to the estate, his suspicions growing with every passing day. Josiah had heard rumors of Hawkins questioning the other staff about the evening's events. What had been eaten, who had served what, who had been standing near Barrett when he started choking. The questions were becoming more direct, and Josiah knew it was only a matter of time before he was called in for questioning. One afternoon, as Josiah was preparing the evening meal, he heard a soft knock at the kitchen door. His heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he wiped his hands on his apron and opened the door. Standing in the doorway was none other than Hawkins, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in Josiah's every movement. "Josiah," Hawkins began, his tone casual, but there was an underlying sharpness to it. "I need a word with you." Josiah nodded silently, stepping aside to let the lieutenant into the kitchen. Hawkins surveyed the room, his eyes taking in every detail, from the pots bubbling over the stove to the neatly organized utensils on the counter. The lieutenant's presence in the kitchen felt suffocating. Josiah could sense that Hawkins wasn't just here to ask questions. He was searching for something. Hawkins turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "I've been speaking with some of the other staff, Josiah. They all have the same story. Mr. Barrett ate the stew, he started feeling ill, and he collapsed. No one saw anything unusual. But something doesn't add up." Josiah's eyes met Hawkins', his expression calm and steady. He knew exactly where this was going. Hawkins was fishing for answers, hoping to catch him off guard. But Josiah had been in control of his emotions for too long to let a slip-up happen now. "I prepared the meal, sir," Josiah replied, his voice even. "Everything was cooked with the same care I put into all the meals I make. I'm not sure what happened after that. I'm just a cook after all." Hawkins stared at him for a moment, his eyes piercing as though trying to see through Josiah's calm exterior. "I understand. But you see, Josiah, there's one thing that doesn't quite add up in your story. You see, I've spoken to the others who were in the kitchen that night. They all say the same thing. No one saw you leave the kitchen once you brought out the stew." Josiah's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Hawkins had a sharp mind, and Josiah knew the lieutenant wasn't just looking for the truth. He was looking for any crack in the facade that Josiah had so carefully built. "What are you implying, Lieutenant?" Josiah asked, his voice controlled, but the question hung in the air, a challenge. Hawkins didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer to Josiah, his gaze intense. "What I'm implying, Josiah, is that you had the opportunity. You were alone in the kitchen preparing the food, and you knew exactly who Mr. Barrett was, what he stood for, what kind of man he was." Josiah's jaw tightened. He could feel the pressure building, but he refused to give Hawkins the satisfaction of seeing any weakness. He had done this before. He had dealt with interrogation, with questions that held no truth, with silence that screamed louder than any confession. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Lieutenant," Josiah replied quietly, stepping back from the stove to face Hawkins directly. "But if you're suggesting that I had something to do with Mr. Barrett's condition, then I can assure you you're wrong. I'm just the cook here." Hawkins regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, the lieutenant turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Josiah alone once again. Josiah stood still, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the counter. He had survived the first round of suspicion, but Hawkins was getting closer. The walls were closing in, and Josiah knew he had to be more careful than ever before. His silence had served him well, but in this game of cat and mouse, silence was becoming a dangerous weapon. Josiah had been patient. His first act of revenge, the death of Mr. Barrett, had gone according to plan. The poison had worked, the investigation was still fumbling, and for a moment, it felt like justice was finally within his reach. But he knew better than to think the fight was over. One victim was not enough. Barrett had been only a small part of the picture, a symbol of the many who had wronged him and his people. Josiah had to take this further. The masters of the estate had to feel the same fear, the same helplessness that had plagued his family for generations. They had to know what it was like to be at the mercy of someone they had wronged, someone they had abused without consequence. The second target was a more dangerous one, a man whose name was whispered in fear, whose reputation as a brutal taskmaster was known to all. Mr. Duncan, the estate's owner, was a man who saw nothing but power in his eyes. He had inherited the estate from his father, but unlike his father, he had little concern for the welfare of his workers. Duncan had continued the tradition of cruelty that had been passed down through generations, but with more arrogance, more violence. He was the one who had overseen Josiah's father's brutal punishment, the one who had ordered his hanging. Duncan had enjoyed watching the life drain from Josiah's father's body, taking pleasure in the moment as if it were nothing more than a casual display of power. It was time to make him feel that same helplessness. Josiah had watched Duncan from the shadows, studying his habits. The man was predictable like most of them were. He dined at the same hour every evening, often alone in the grand dining room, indulging in rich meats, fine wines, and decadent desserts. Josiah had learned every detail of Duncan's routine, the exact moment when he would take his first bite of food, the way he savored his meal, the way he would let his guard down in the presence of his food. Josiah had a plan. This time, it wasn't just about poisoning a meal. It was about making Duncan feel the slow build of terror, just as Josiah had felt when he watched his father struggle for air. He knew that Duncan's pride would be his downfall. The man's ego was so inflated that he wouldn't suspect a thing. Josiah had to use his own arrogance against him, and for that, he needed something special. For the second act of revenge, Josiah prepared a dessert. He had always been meticulous about desserts, sweet, delicate, and seemingly harmless. But the poison Josiah had chosen was more potent, more insidious. It was a rare and subtle poison that could take hours to show its full effects, causing its victim to feel lightheaded, weak, and disoriented before the true pain began. It would be slow, but it would be inevitable. Josiah worked late into the night, preparing a rich, decadent chocolate cake, dense, moist, and dripping with cream. He infused the cake batter with a potent dose of the poison, mixing it with care. He added just enough of the bitter substance so that it wouldn't alter the flavor, so Duncan wouldn't suspect a thing. The cake would be perfect, beautiful, and inviting, just like the man who would soon fall victim to it. The next evening, when the moment arrived, Josiah watched from the kitchen as Duncan took his seat at the dining table. The atmosphere was quiet, almost eerily so, as the other guests murmured in soft conversation. Josiah moved swiftly, placing the cake in front of Duncan with a practiced smile. Duncan raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the dessert. "I see the cook's been busy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure this will be delightful." Josiah said nothing, simply nodding as he stepped back. Duncan took a large forkful of the cake, savoring it. Josiah watched closely, his heart pounding as the man chewed, his expression one of contentment. It was only a matter of time now. As Duncan continued to eat, Josiah's thoughts turned inward. This time, he wasn't just enacting revenge for himself. He was doing it for every soul who had suffered under the hands of men like Duncan. He was doing it for the slaves who had worked the land, for the families who had been torn apart, for his father who had never had a chance to see justice. The cake was eaten slowly, Duncan taking his time, savoring each bite as the guests watched him. Josiah maintained his composure, his expression unreadable. But inside, he felt a small flicker of satisfaction. This was his moment. As Duncan finished the last bite, he wiped his mouth and sat back in his chair, a smug smile still lingering on his face. "Well," he said, leaning back, "that was an excellent dessert. It seems we're in the hands of a real artist in the kitchen." Josiah stood silently, his eyes never leaving Duncan's face. But he could already see the first signs of the poison taking hold. Duncan's hand began to shake, his face growing paler by the second. At first, it was subtle, just a slight twitch in his fingers, a soft gasp as he tried to take a deep breath. But soon, the symptoms grew worse. Duncan's eyes widened in panic as his breath became shallow and labored. He reached for his throat, but it was too late. The poison was working its way through his system, slowly paralyzing him. He slumped forward in his chair, his body growing weak, his mind clouded with confusion. He tried to speak, but only gasps escaped. The guests around him stared in shock, not knowing what to make of the sudden change in their host's condition. Josiah's eyes never left him. He felt no joy, no pleasure. This was simply justice, cold and final. The estate was in chaos. Word had spread quickly that Duncan had collapsed at the dinner table, his breath shallow and labored as he tried to cling to life. Servants rushed back and forth, trying to help, though there was little they could do. Josiah had already slipped into the shadows, careful to remain unseen as the scene unfolded before him. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He had done it. The poison had worked. Duncan was as good as gone. Lieutenant Hawkins had returned to the estate, his face a mask of grim determination. The investigation was escalating, and everyone who had been involved in the meal, every servant who had worked the night of Barrett's death, was now a suspect. Josiah could feel the weight of the lieutenant's scrutiny, even from the kitchen, where he tried to keep his movements slow and deliberate. He was aware of every step, every gesture. One mistake, one slip, and everything would come crashing down. The lieutenant entered the dining room, his eyes scanning the chaos. He was a man accustomed to dealing with death, but the scene before him was unsettling even for him. Duncan lay unconscious on the floor, the guests staring at him in shock and confusion. Hawkins stepped toward the body, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Hawkins asked one of the servants, his voice low, but carrying an edge that made the air feel thick with tension. The servant, a woman named Mariah, stammered, We don't know, sir. He was fine one moment and then he couldn't breathe. He just collapsed." Hawkins nodded, his gaze turning toward the kitchen. Josiah's breath caught in his throat. Hawkins was already looking for answers. He was already suspecting foul play. It wouldn't be long before Josiah would be called in for questioning. His mind raced. He had to act fast. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Hawkins appeared, his eyes immediately locking onto Josiah. There was no preamble, no small talk. Hawkins knew what he was here for, and Josiah could feel the pressure mounting. "Josiah," Hawkins said, his tone firm, "I need to speak with you. Now." Josiah didn't flinch. He didn't move. He merely nodded, his face calm and expressionless. Inside, however, his heart was pounding. This was it, the moment when everything would either fall apart or fall into place. He followed Hawkins into a quiet corner of the estate, away from the others, where the shadows seemed to stretch and grow. The walls felt closer here, as if they were closing in on him. Hawkins stood in front of him, his gaze unwavering. "You've been quiet, Josiah," Hawkins said, his voice low and deliberate. "But we both know you had something to do with Barrett's death. And now we have Duncan. What's your plan, Cook?" Josiah remained silent for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew Hawkins had caught on to him, but there was no use in pretending anymore. The investigation had narrowed in on him, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But Josiah had expected this. He had always known the moment would come when the walls would close in, and when they did, he would stand his ground. "You think I poisoned Duncan?" Josiah finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. Hawkins didn't respond immediately, but his expression hardened. Josiah continued, "Duncan deserved it, Lieutenant. He deserved it just as much as Barrett did. I did what needed to be done." Hawkins' eyes narrowed. "You think this is justice? Killing them, poisoning them like animals?" His voice grew louder. "You think you're some kind of avenger?" Josiah's eyes were cold as he met Hawkins' gaze. "You don't understand, Lieutenant. You can't. They've been getting away with murder for too long. I'm not the only one who's suffered. I'm not the only one who's seen what they've done to others. But now they will know what it feels like. What it feels like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else." Hawkins stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "You think this will make you feel better? That killing them will bring your father back? That it'll give you the peace you think you deserve?" Josiah's face darkened. He stepped closer to Hawkins, his voice a whisper but filled with fury. "You don't get to tell me how to grieve. You don't get to tell me how to get justice. I did what I had to do, and if I have to keep going, I will. But I'm not the one you need to be afraid of." Hawkins hesitated, his gaze lingering on Josiah's face. It was clear now the cook wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He had chosen this path. He had embraced it. And now Hawkins realized there was no stopping him. Josiah turned away, his back to the lieutenant. "I'm not afraid of you. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." As Josiah walked back toward the kitchen, his mind remained focused. This confrontation had been necessary. It had confirmed that Hawkins knew too much. But Josiah had no intention of stopping. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. He would finish what he had started. The investigation had come to an end, but the truth had remained hidden in the shadows. The estate was quiet now, the frantic energy of the past few days giving way to a strange, uneasy calm. Lieutenant Hawkins had left, but Josiah could still feel the weight of his presence. He had come so close to uncovering everything, yet the investigation had stalled, nothing but whispers and suspicions remaining in the air. For Josiah, there was no real resolution. He had taken his revenge, but the satisfaction he had once anticipated was absent. The faces of those he had killed, Barrett and Duncan, haunted him now, their last breaths still echoing in his mind. He had wanted justice, but what he had found instead was emptiness. As he stood in the quiet kitchen, Josiah wiped down the counter for the 100th time that evening. The motion was automatic, his thoughts far away, lost in the same dark place they had been since that fateful night when his father was taken from him. He had worked tirelessly to create the perfect dishes, the perfect poisons, but now, with the victims gone, the power he had sought seemed hollow. The vengeance he had exacted had come at a cost, one he wasn't sure he had anticipated. Josiah's hands trembled slightly as he set the rag down. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the faint glow of the setting sun was just beginning to fade. The world outside was moving on, oblivious to the chaos and death that had unfolded in the quiet corners of this estate. The estate staff had returned to their duties, but there was a palpable shift. They spoke in hushed voices when they thought he wasn't listening, their eyes lingering on him with a mix of respect and fear. Josiah wasn't sure if it was the power he had taken, or the terror of knowing what he was capable of, but it didn't matter anymore. He had won the respect he had been denied, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself. The last few days had been a blur. Josiah had watched the nobles, the masters, scurry in fear, their wealth and status crumbling under the weight of their own guilt. But it wasn't enough to bring his father back. It wasn't enough to fill the hole that had been left in his heart. The pain of loss, the sense of injustice would never go away. He thought of his father again, remembering the man who had raised him, the man whose voice had been silenced too soon. Josiah had promised himself that he would make them pay, that he would bring justice to those who had wronged him. But now, standing alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the silence he had so carefully created, Josiah realized something. Revenge hadn't healed the wounds. it had only opened them wider. He took a deep breath, looking around the room. The kitchen, which had once been a place of control and power, now felt like a prison. He had taken everything he wanted, but at what cost? The years of planning, the quiet manipulation, had brought him to this point, and now he had nothing left but the emptiness of his own choices. Josiah's reflection in the polished countertop stared back at him, and for the first time, he saw himself clearly. He wasn't the victim anymore. He wasn't the boy who had watched his father die. He had become the very thing he had once hated. And in that moment, Josiah realized that the revenge he had sought was never about justice. It had been about something much darker, a need to prove his power, to claim control over a world that had never shown him mercy. He didn't know what the future held for him. He didn't know if he would ever find peace. But for now, he could only continue. The kitchen, with its sharp knives and simmering pots, would remain his domain. The world outside might never know the full extent of the cook who served death in every dish. But Josiah didn't need them to. He knew what he had done, and in his silence, he had already claimed victory.